My name is Ensley Woods, and I was 28 years old the day a neighbor called to tell me my grandmother had died, because my own parents hadn't thought I deserved to know. A decade earlier, my mother and father had set two suitcases out on the front porch 2 weeks after my 18th birthday and changed the locks while I stood there holding my backpack. Now here they were, seated in the front pew at Nana's funeral, my mother squeezing my hand as if she'd done it every single day for 10 years, leaning in to whisper that we should talk about the estate, sweetheart, as a family. They thought they were walking back into my life for the money. What they actually walked into was the one room left in America where my grandmother could still speak for herself. And what the judge read aloud that day, the part buried on page 4, caught every single one of us off guard, myself included. If you've ever been made to feel like your whole life was owed to your family, this story is for you. Stay with me. The two countries. I was on shift the night Ruth called. I work as a hospice nurse, and that Tuesday in March, I was sitting with a patient on the other side of the county, holding his hand through the stillness of 4 a.m, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I stepped into the corridor to answer. Ruth Delgado had lived next door to my grandmother for 30 years, and she was crying so hard I could barely make out her words at first. Marlene Woods had passed away in her sleep sometime before dawn, peacefully, in her own bed, in her own house, the only way she would ever have agreed to go. Then Ruth said the thing that turned my blood to ice. "Honey, your parents have known since 7 this morning. I kept waiting for you to show up. When you never did, I figured nobody had told you." It was past 4 in the afternoon. 9 hours. My grandmother had been gone for 9 hours, and the two people who called themselves my family had let a neighbor be the one to tell me. I drove the 20 minutes to Maple Glen with steady hands on the wheel, because hospice work teaches you to fall apart later, on your own schedule. Her porch light was already on. It switched on every evening at 7, and it was burning now against the dusk, as though nothing in the world had changed. Taped to the front door was an index card, written in my mother's tidy loan officer handwriting. "Contents inventoried. Please do not remove items. Signed G and P Woods." She hadn't been gone a full day, and my parents had already cataloged everything inside the house. All I'd seen was a porch light. I stood there a long while, remembering the last time I'd stood on those same boards with suitcases at my feet. To understand any of this, you need to understand the house I grew up in. In my mother's kitchen, taped to the refrigerator where other families hung crayon drawings, there was an invoice. She'd started it the month I turned 16. Room and board, $150 a month, itemized in blue ink with a running balance at the bottom. My mother had spent 20 years as a loan officer, and she ran our household exactly the way she ran her desk. Birthday presents came with a reminder attached. "That coat wasn't cheap, Ensley. Remember everything we do for you." Every kindness got logged somewhere, quietly accruing interest. My father never argued with the system. He sat behind his newspaper at the table like a man waiting out a storm, and whenever I looked to him for help, he'd offer only a small, apologetic shrug, as though the ledger were a law of nature and not simply his wife's handwriting. Then there was Nana's kitchen, 6 streets over. Saturday mornings meant pancakes on a griddle older than my father, coupons clipped and filed in a shoebox, coffee so weak you could read a newspaper straight through it. Once, when I was maybe 12, I asked what I owed her for gas money after she'd driven me somewhere for school. She laughed so hard she had to sit down. "Eat your pancakes," she said. "You don't owe me a thing. You never will." Same last name, same town. 2 entirely different countries. I spent my whole childhood crossing the border between them, wondering why love cost so much in one house and nothing at all in the other. I didn't have a word for it back then. I just knew that in one kitchen I was a daughter, and in the other, I was a debt. In the spring of 2014, those two countries went to war. The petition. In April of that year, when I was 17, Nana had a small stroke. The doctors said it had clipped the edges of her speech for a few weeks and left her right hand slower than she liked. She attacked her recovery the way she attacked a sewing bin, with a list and absolutely no patience. I drove her to physical therapy every afternoon after school in her old Buick. And that's how I ended up watching exactly what my parents did next. My mother showed up at the hospital carrying a folder. Inside were glossy brochures for a place called Willow Crest Senior Living and a printed estimate from a realtor valuing Nana's house. Nana was still slurring her R's, and my mother was already pricing the walls around her. She told relatives she was simply getting ahead of things. She told the doctors she was the responsible one in the family. She used the word manage so often, it began to sound like a threat. Nana said no. Slowly, but clearly. That should have been the end of the conversation. Except a few weeks later, I came downstairs for a glass of water and heard my parents at the kitchen table with a calculator out. My mother was using words I'd never heard her say before. Petition, power of attorney, guardianship. My father just kept saying, "If you think it's best, Pam." I was 17, standing in the dark hallway of that house, Googling those words on my phone, and my stomach dropped straight through the floor. My mother wasn't planning to help her mother-in-law recover. She was planning to ask a court to declare Nana legally incompetent, take control of her money, and sell her house. 3 weeks later, she filed the paperwork for real. Here's what my parents hadn't counted on. When someone in Ohio files to have a person declared incompetent, the court doesn't simply take their word for it. It sends someone to look. The court investigator was a tired woman with kind eyes and a clipboard. She came to Nana's house on a Thursday in July, right after one of our therapy sessions. She watched Nana brew coffee, pay her water bill at the kitchen table, correctly name the sitting president, the current year, and the exact price of ground beef at Hartman's Grocery, which Nana considered the only piece of current events that actually mattered. Then the investigator took me out onto the porch alone and started asking questions. I was 17, and I understood with total clarity that both countries were listening for my answer. I told the truth. I told her Nana cooked her own meals and balanced her own checkbook. I showed her the little school notebook where I'd been logging our therapy schedule. Every session recorded in gel pen, 5 months of Tuesdays and Thursdays. I told her my grandmother was the most competent person I knew, and that nobody in that house needed managing. Dr. Patel, who had been Nana's physician for 20 years, told the court the exact same thing in writing. In August of 2014, the petition was denied. Nana kept her house, her money, and her name. My mother didn't scream. That's the part people always get wrong about her. She walked out of that courthouse with her chin level, drove me home in a silence you could have stood a spoon in, and said one quiet thing at a red light without ever turning her head. "You'll learn what loyalty costs, Ensley." I thought it was just something bitter people say. 2 months later, I learned it was an actual invoice. 2 suitcases. I turned 18 at the end of September. 2 weeks after that, I came home from my shift at the pancake diner, and my key wouldn't turn. The porch light of my parents' house was dark, but I could make out the shapes waiting on the welcome mat. 2 suitcases, packed neatly, my old backpack from junior year sitting on top like a bow. My mother opened the door about 4 inches, chains still latched. She wasn't angry. She was composed, the exact way she looked at her desk when declining somebody's loan application. "You're 18 now," she said. "You made your choice in that courtroom. Family is a ledger, Ensley, and you are deep in the red." Behind her, at the edge of the hallway light, I could see my father's silhouette behind the curtain, not moving. That shadow told me everything I would ever need to know about him. The door closed. The deadbolt turned. I stood on the porch of the house I'd grown up in, doing math no 18-year-old should have to do. How much was in my checking account, whose couch I could ask for, how many shifts until I could scrape together first and last month's rent. Then I picked up the suitcases and walked 6 streets through the October dark, and I knocked on Nana's door at 11 at night. She opened it in her bathrobe, looked at me, looked at the suitcases, and didn't ask a single question. She simply reached past me, flipped a switch, and the porch light came on above my head, warm and yellow. "Love doesn't keep books, honey," she said. "It keeps a light on." From that night on, for the rest of her life, that light burned every single evening, so I'd always know exactly which house was mine. I wish I could tell you the next 10 years were some kind of triumphant montage. Mostly they were just long. I lived in Nana's spare room for a year, then a studio above the hardware store. I waited tables, took out loans, and put myself through nursing school. I'm proud of that. I won't pretend it was tidy. In November of 2015, when I was 19, I broke. 13 months of double shifts and silence from 2 people whose voices still followed me into sleep had worn me down to nothing. One night, my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my thoughts turned into a drain I couldn't stop circling. I drove myself to the county hospital and admitted myself. 72 hours in the behavioral health unit. I checked myself in alone, and 3 days later, I checked myself out alone. And I told exactly one living soul about it, which is to say, nobody. Not even Nana. I walked out of that building with one rule carved somewhere permanent in me. Need nothing, owe nothing. If no one is ever holding anything of yours, no one can drop it. For 10 years, that rule felt like strength. Remember it, it comes back later, in a courtroom, in the worst possible way. The years stacked up quietly after that. I got my nursing license at 22 and found my way into hospice care, which sounds grim to people who've never done it and feels almost sacred to everyone who has. Sunday mornings still belong to Nana's kitchen. Pancakes, weak coffee, her reading the obituaries out loud like box scores. 10 good years. The diagnosis. In the fall of 2024, Anna started making appointments she wouldn't explain, driving herself downtown to see a lawyer named Harriet Cole, coming home each time with her mouth pressed flat, like a woman sealing an envelope. The diagnosis came that October. Congestive heart failure. End stage. Nana took the news the way she took an expired coupon. Brief irritation followed by immediate planning. She chose hospice care at home. And because life enjoys its little ironies, the case landed with Corrin County Hospice, the very agency I worked for, though not with me directly. I want to be precise here, because it matters later. I was never officially her nurse. That role belonged to a colleague named Dana, who managed her medications and her chart. I was simply her granddaughter. I did granddaughter things. I cooked, I sat with her, I drove her places. I lost at gin rummy on purpose, and got caught doing it. The green kitchen table filled up on a rotation Nana never scheduled but absolutely commanded. Ruth from next door, Carmen Fairfield, who owned the diner and brought pie along with strong opinions, half the gray-haired women of Maple Glen passing through that kitchen like it was a chapel with better snacks. Twice more that winter, Nana had Harriet Cole over, and the 2 of them would shut themselves in the dining room for an hour at a time. When I asked what it was about, she'd wave a hand. Paperwork, honey. Old women and their paperwork. But one night in February, near the end, she was sitting up against her pillows, looking smaller than I could stand, and she grabbed my wrist with more strength than she had any business having. "When they come smiling," she said, "you let Harriet do the talking first. Promise me." "When who comes smiling, Nana?" She just looked at me steadily, the exact way she'd looked at that court investigator a decade earlier. "Promise me," she said again. So I promised. 3 weeks later, she was gone, and I was standing on her porch reading an index card taped to the door. The reading. My parents ran the funeral like a campaign event. My mother wore the correct shade of black and cried at the correct volume, dabbing carefully beneath her eyes to protect her makeup. My father stood at the church door shaking every hand in Maple Glen, accepting condolences for a woman he had once tried to have declared legally incompetent. I watched people who didn't know any better squeeze his shoulder in sympathy. I sat with Ruth and Carmen. I'd been up all night with a patient and was running on hospice autopilot, which is probably the only reason I didn't flinch when my mother materialized beside me at the casket. 10 years of silence, and she slid her arm through mine as if we did this every Sunday. Her perfume hadn't changed a bit. "She looks peaceful," my mother said. Then, in the very same breath, with the casket less than 2 feet away, "We should talk about the estate, sweetheart. As a family." As a family. I hadn't been family since an October night in 2014. But apparently, Nana's money didn't know that yet, as far as my mother was concerned. Across the aisle, my cousin Kayla, 26 now, gave me a small wave and then glanced quickly down at her phone. I noticed that too. Hospice work teaches you to tell the difference between people crying for the dying and people crying for the furniture. I said nothing. I'd made a promise about exactly this moment, even if I didn't fully understand it yet. 2 days later, a letter arrived. Cream envelope, Law Office of Harriet Cole, addressed to me, with copies noted to Gregory and Pamela Woods. All interested parties were invited to attend the reading of Marlene Woods' estate plan on Thursday at 10 in the morning. My phone rang within the hour. My mother, warm as fresh bread. "We'll pick you up, sweetheart. We should walk in together." I drove myself. Harriet Cole's office had law books lining the walls, and a coffee machine older than I was. Harriet herself turned out to be 66, reading glasses on a chain, with the general bearing of a woman who had never once been successfully talked over. My parents arrived in their church clothes. My mother had brought a leather folio, which sat on her lap the entire meeting, ready. Harriet read without any theatrics. The estate of Marlene Woods, held inside the Marlene Woods Revocable Trust, consisted of the house on Sycamore Street, appraised at $475,000. The commercial building downtown that used to house her fabric shop, the Spool and Thimble, now leased out and valued at $610,000. Investment accounts totaling $2,290,000, built from 40 years of fabric sales, index funds, and the deep patience of a woman who considered paying retail a moral failing. And cash and personal property worth $125,000. $3.5 million. Every cent of it. The house, the building, the accounts, all of it. To her granddaughter, Ensley Woods, sole beneficiary. To her son Gregory and his wife Pamela, $10,000 each, with my thanks for the lesson they taught me in 2014. The room went so quiet I could hear the coffee machine gurgling. I sat there with my ears ringing, watching my mother. Because 10 years of missing someone teaches you exactly how to read them. She didn't flinch. She smiled. She reached over, took my hand in both of hers, and said, warm as a heating pad, "Oh, sweetheart, what a responsibility for you. Of course we'll manage it for you." As though the money had arrived with an errand attached. I gently pulled my hand back. "No, thank you." My mother kept smiling as she gathered up her coat, and that smile frightened me far more than the index card on the door ever had. It was the smile of a woman with a plan. Casserole diplomacy. Their first move wasn't a lawyer. Their first move was dinner. My mother called that Sunday, and her voice carried a register I'd never heard her use with me. Soft, unhurried, almost shy. She wanted me over for dinner. No business talk, Ensley, no estate discussion. Just family. She'd missed me. I want to be honest about what happened inside my chest when she said that, because I suspect some of you already know. I was 28 years old. I owned scrubs older than my relationship with my parents, and some animal part of me, some 18-year-old still standing on a dark porch doing math, sat straight up at the sound of my mother saying she'd missed me, the way a dog perks up at keys jingling in a door. I knew exactly what this was. Let me be clear about that. I had watched this woman price a stroke victim's house from a hospital visitor's chair. People ask afterward why I even went. Here's the truest answer I have. You can know precisely what someone is and still be starving for them. Estrangement doesn't kill the hunger. It just teaches you to eat around it. So I said yes. I told myself it was reconnaissance. I ironed a blouse like it was armor and drove the 40 minutes to a brick house in Dayton with no porch light burning. I sat in my old chair at my mother's table, and for 1 hour, I'll admit this to you and to no one else, it was nice. The pot roast tasted the same, the stories were the same, my father laughed at my jokes. Then the dessert plates came out, and beside my slice of pie, my mother set down a plastic-bound folder. The cover read, "Woods Family Wealth Management Plan," in the exact font of a bank brochure. My mother had built a presentation around my inheritance. Inside, in neatly tabbed sections, was the entire architecture. A family LLC to hold the house, the building, and the accounts, managing members, listed as Gregory and Pamela Woods, a monthly allowance for me, the word allowance, printed in black and white, aimed at a 28-year-old woman who worked solo night shifts beside dying strangers. Page 6 had a signature line with a little plastic arrow sticker pointing exactly where I was supposed to sign my grandmother's life over to the 2 people she had specifically shut out of it. My father studied his pie. That shadow behind the curtain again, just better lit this time. My mother talked the entire time in her loan officer voice. Reasonable, warm, peppered with terms like fiduciary responsibility and protecting the assets, and "you're so busy with your work, honey." I let her finish. Hospice teaches you that, too. Letting people finish. Then I closed the folder, set it beside my plate, and said, "Thank you for dinner. The pot roast was perfect. I'm not signing this." The temperature in that dining room dropped 10 degrees in a single second. My mother looked at me for a long moment, and the softness drained out of her face like someone had flipped a switch at the main breaker. What remained was the woman from the courthouse parking lot in 2014. "We tried the nice way," she said. I picked up my purse and let myself out past the dark porch. That night, I made an enemy on purpose for the first time in my life. You're about to see exactly what it cost them. Served. 3 weeks later, a man in a golf shirt walked up to the nurse's station at the hospice office, asked if I was Ensley Woods, and handed me a manila envelope in front of 2 coworkers and a grieving family. "You've been served. Have a good one." I read it in my car. Filed in the probate court of Corrin County, Ohio, Gregory Woods and Pamela Woods, petitioners, contesting the last will and trust of Marlene Woods. And the grounds turned my hands cold on the steering wheel. Undue influence by a caregiver. Lack of testamentary capacity. 11 pages of legal language rearranging my entire life into a crime. The granddaughter recast as a professional caregiver who had isolated a dying woman, alienated her from her devoted son, and steered $3.5 million into her own pocket. They wanted the trust thrown out entirely. They wanted the estate distributed as though no will existed, which, under Ohio law, would hand a son his mother's entire fortune. Buried in the motions was the real tell, the sentence with my mother's fingerprints all over it. Petitioners further request the court appoint them as interim managers of the estate during these proceedings. Manage it for you. She'd finally found a way to write it into legal stationery. Everything froze. The accounts, the house, all of it locked while the court decided whether my grandmother had been of sound mind. A question Nana would have found absolutely hilarious, and then filed away somewhere for revenge. Harriet called that evening. Her voice was as level as I'd learned to lean on. "They have every legal right to file this," she said. "That's the ugly beauty of the law, Ensley. Any fool can knock on the courthouse door. Come to my office. Your grandmother left instructions for exactly this knock." Before I could get there, the family phone tree got busy. You have to understand how a smear travels through a small county. It doesn't march, it seeps. My aunt in Columbus heard I'd written myself into the will. A great-uncle heard I'd been over-medicating Marlene at the end. You know, she's a nurse. By Friday, a woman at Hartman's Grocery looked at me one beat too long over the cart corral, and I knew my mother's version of me had already beaten me to the checkout line. Then Kayla texted. My cousin, the one I'd taught to parallel park, the one whose prom dress Nana had hemmed for free. "Hey, I just think you should do the right thing and share. They're your parents. Aunt Pam says you'll be hearing from the lawyers anyway." I stared at that message for a long time, typed a reply, deleted it twice, and set the phone face down. An hour later, I picked it back up and found I'd been blocked. Allie removed from the board. That one cost me something real. And for the record, it cost her more in the end, just not in money. There's no coupon for landing on the wrong side when it counts. That Sunday, sitting in my dark apartment above the hardware store, phone face down, someone knocked. Ruth Delgado stood in the hallway holding a pot of chicken soup with both hands, like a weapon shaped like comfort food, her eyes dry and furious. "You're not answering your phone," she said, brushing past me toward the stove. "So I'll say it here. Marlene told us this would happen. All of it, honey. Every move they're making, she called it. Marlene told us." I wanted more, but Ruth only patted my hand and said Harriet would be the one to explain things properly. She'd just brought the soup. 2 things happened that same week. First, Harriet, acting as trustee, asked me to move into Nana's house. An occupied house is an insured house. An empty one is a liability, and the fight could drag on for a year. My parents' lawyer objected within a day, calling it the caregiver occupying the disputed asset. Harriet replied in writing that the trustee had simply made an operational decision. and the petitioners were welcome to raise it with Judge Marsh. So I packed the same 2 suitcases, out of some instinct I chose not to examine, and moved 6 streets over into the house with the porch light. Second, on my first night there, I went looking for the switch myself. I wanted to be the one to turn it on, the way she'd once turned it on for me. I traced the wire from the porch fixture back into the hall closet, and there, mounted above the fuse box, was a small mechanical timer, beige plastic, older than I was, its dial notched precisely at 7 in the evening. She hadn't been flipping that switch by hand all those years. She'd bought a machine to keep a promise she made me back in October of 2014, and that machine had kept it every single evening for over a decade, through storms and holidays and her own dying. It was still keeping it. Click. 7 o'clock. Light on. Whether the woman who'd made the promise was alive or not. I sat on the closet floor and finally fell apart quietly, on my own time. Then I did something that didn't come naturally to me. When Ruth knocked that evening with a 3rd pot of soup, instead of telling her I was fine, my entire personality up to that point, I opened the door all the way and let her in. She looked around at the green table and said, "Good. Now, has Harriet shown you the letters yet?" The fortress. Harriet spread the file across her conference table the next morning, like a surgeon laying out instruments. "Your grandmother," she said, "didn't guess. She remembered." Then she walked me through the fortress Marlene Woods had spent 10 years quietly constructing. The trust had been created in March of 2015, 5 months after my suitcases landed on that porch. She'd sat in this very office, 72 years old, furious in her Sunday coat, and told Harriet she'd just watched exactly what her son would do for money, and she intended to make herself useless to him ever again. Every few years, she came back and tightened another bolt. The final amendment was dated January of 2024, 9 months before any diagnosis, before hospice was ever mentioned, back when she was still hauling her own mulch. Attached to it were 2 letters from 2 separate doctors, Dr. Patel and an internist in Dayton she'd booked entirely on her own. Each examined her the same week she signed. Each certified her memory and judgment. And Dr. Patel's letter noted, in characteristically dry language, a degree of financial acumen exceeding my own. Harriet had met with her alone each time. No family present in the building. Standard protocol followed to the letter. Every meeting logged. "Do you see it?" Harriet asked. "Capacity documented twice, independently, dated. Influence made impossible." I hadn't even known the trust existed. My grandmother had built her paperwork like a woman who'd been ambushed once and never intended to be caught unprepared again. Every bolt she'd tightened was aimed squarely at one future Thursday in a courtroom. "There's more," Harriet said, closing the folder. For the first time, something like anticipation crossed her face. "There's a page I'm not permitted to show you before the hearing. Marlene's instructions. She wrote them down herself." "Her instructions say you can't show me?" Harriet almost smiled. "Her instructions say Judge Marsh gets to read it first, out loud." She was very specific about the out loud part. The deposition. In August, they deposed me. If you've never sat through a deposition, picture a conference room, a court reporter, a camera, and a lawyer paid handsomely to unstitch you politely. My parents' attorney was a man named Barrett Voss, 50s, silver-rimmed glasses, the bedside manner of a paper cut. For 2 hours, he asked reasonable questions in a reasonable voice. My shift schedule, my access to Nana's house, whether I'd ever driven her to the bank, cooked her meals, been alone with her. Every ordinary mechanic of loving someone elderly, replayed slowly enough to start resembling something sinister. Was I present when medications were administered? Had I benefited from her isolation? Then, without any shift in tone, as though he were commenting on the weather, Voss slid the knife in. Miss Woods, have you ever been admitted to a psychiatric facility, voluntarily or otherwise? The court reporter's hands never stopped moving. The camera's red light held steady on my face. 10 years I'd kept that November locked away in a drawer no one else knew existed. And this man had a copy of the key sitting right there in a folder. Which meant my parents had gone digging through the worst night of my life and handed it to him as ammunition. Because that's exactly what it was. The how of it turned out to be embarrassingly simple. At 19, I was still listed on my father's health insurance, and the statements go to the policyholder. They'd known for 10 years. They'd known, said nothing, and saved it. I heard my lawyer object on relevance grounds. I answered anyway, level, in the voice I use at 4 in the morning with frightened patients. Yes, in 2015, for 3 days, I checked myself in, and I checked myself out. Voss made a small, satisfied note, and, without seeming to know it, or maybe knowing exactly what he was doing, quoted my own mother back at me. Debts of gratitude are still debts. Wouldn't you agree? I didn't answer that one. When it ended, he squared his papers like a man clearing a dinner table. We'll see you at the hearing, Miss Woods. Unless your family would rather settle this like a family. In the parking garage afterward, my hands finally shook. 2 weeks later, my supervisor called me in before my shift and couldn't quite meet my eyes. An anonymous complaint had been filed with the Ohio Board of Nursing. Elder financial abuse by a hospice professional. Anonymous, but it cited the probate case number, which more or less settles the question of who wrote it. And here's the part outsiders rarely understand about licensed work. It doesn't matter how absurd a complaint is. The board is required to investigate. That process can take months, and while it grinds along, an agency that cares for the dying cannot keep a nurse on staff under an open abuse investigation. Nobody was cruel about it, which somehow made it worse. My supervisor's voice wobbled as she asked for my badge. I unclipped it and set it on her desk. 6 years of night shifts reduced to a rectangle of laminate. And I walked out through a lobby with a wall that read "Dignity" in 4 languages. I understood then exactly what they'd found. The trust was a fortress, so they'd stopped shooting at the fortress. They were shooting at me. My license was the one thing I'd built entirely on my own. No inheritance, no help, just years of 12-hour nights and a state exam. And my parents had realized it was the one thing the court couldn't protect for me. By then, my savings were nearly gone too. The trust could fund Harriet's defense of the trust. That's how the law works. But it couldn't pay for my private attorney or my licensing defense. 18 of my remaining $21,000 had already gone out the door. That night, I sat in my car outside Nana's house and watched the porch light click on at 7, right on schedule. A dead woman keeping her promise, while I tried to figure out how to keep mine. Then an email arrived from Voss's office. His clients, it said, remained open to a family resolution. The people who'd started the fire were now selling extinguishers. The preliminary hearing took place in October, in a small oak-paneled courtroom at the Corrin County Courthouse, Judge Ellen Marsh presiding. A woman in her 60s with the patience of someone who has heard every possible version of every possible family. My parents sat at the petitioner's table in their church clothes. My mother looked serene. She whispered something to Voss and smiled, scanning the room like it already belonged to her. I honestly believe that in her mind, this was the finish line. The day the court would finally hand a responsible adult the keys. Judge Marsh put on her glasses and paged silently through the trust documents. Then she stopped turning pages. "Counsel," she said to Voss, "before we schedule anything further, has your client read Article 9 of this instrument?" She read it aloud into the record, her courtroom voice carrying all the way to the back row. Article 9. If any beneficiary of the trust contests its validity or attempts to seize control of its assets through legal proceedings, that beneficiary forfeits any and all interest granted under the trust. The $10,000 bequests to Gregory and Pamela Woods were conditional. Contest the trust, and the gift disappears entirely. My mother's smile held. 10,000 meant nothing set against 3.5 million. But the judge wasn't finished. "There is an attached statement of intent," she said, "executed and notarized in January of 2024. The testator requested it be read aloud in open court in the event of any challenge." She turned to the page and read, "From Marlene Woods. In 2014, my son Gregory and his wife Pamela petitioned to have me declared incompetent so they could manage my affairs. The court said no. I have spent 10 years making certain the answer stays no. If they are standing in your courtroom now, they have come after my death, smiling, offering to manage what I left behind. I ask that you read this page to them so they understand that I am, one final time, ahead of them." The silence that followed was absolute, and I watched it land in real time. The thing from the title. My mother's smile never broke outright. It simply drained away from the eyes down, like something had been unplugged. My grandmother had predicted their exact move, in writing, 16 months before they made it, and every stranger in that courtroom had just heard it read aloud. Voss rose anyway and requested a full evidentiary hearing on undue influence, since if the trust itself fell, Article 9 would fall with it. Judge Marsh granted it, scheduled it for 6 weeks out, and I would swear, on the green table itself, that she looked at my parents half a second longer than she strictly needed to. In the hallway afterward, my mother came straight to me, her perfume unchanged, and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "You think a dead woman can protect you?" 3 nights later, my father showed up at the house, alone. I found him standing at the bottom of the porch steps, inside the ring of light, not knocking. A 59-year-old man turning his car keys over in his hand like a hat he wasn't sure how to hold. I stayed in the doorway. He looked older than he had at the funeral. "Your mother wasn't always like this," he said. And then he told me a story I'd never once heard in all my years as their daughter. My mother's own mother had died in 1991 when my mom was 23. There was no estate, just a shoebox full of bills, collection notices, a repossessed car, a funeral nobody could afford. My mother had worked 3 jobs to bury her own mother and spent 2 years paying off a dead woman's debts. She came out of it with one conviction welded permanently into place. Money left unmanaged is a knife left on the floor, and whoever grabs it first and controls it is the one who truly loves the family. "She thinks she's protecting you," he said, "from ending up like her mother. She can't hear how it sounds anymore." For a second, standing in Nana's doorway, I saw the whole sad machine of it clearly. A terrified 23-year-old building a ledger so the floor could never fall out from under her again. I felt the old pull of that ache. I want you to know pity is real, even when it changes absolutely nothing. Because here's what I said back. "And you? What's your excuse?" He looked down at his keys, the shadow behind the curtain again, the silence behind the newspaper. 40 years distilled into, "If you think it's best, Pam." "Just give her something, Ensley," he said finally. "She'll stop. We can be done." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "She's wrong." An installment plan. I told him goodnight and closed the door gently. 3 days later, my mother offered me the one thing money can't buy, and I almost took it. It arrived in her handwriting, 4 pages, the exact letter I'd been composing in my head for 10 years. "Ensley, my firstborn, not a day has passed. We can withdraw everything, the case, the complaint, all of it. Tomorrow. Come home. Sunday dinners, Christmas, your old room. We'll be a family again, the way your grandmother would have wanted. All we ask is that the estate be divided fairly and managed properly, by all of us, together." I sat under the porch light with those pages until 2 in the morning. I won't perform strength for you here. I read it 9 or 10 times. The animal in my chest, the one that sat up at the sound of her voice on the phone, was howling. Because this was the actual prize, wasn't it? Not the money. The reopened door. The burned ledger. My mother and my father at a table with me. Nobody keeping score. I had testified against them at 17 and been billed for it ever since. And here, finally, was the invoice marked paid in full. All it would cost was everything Nana had spent 10 years building, handed straight to the people she'd built it against, plus one signature agreeing that their version of love had been a reasonable price all along. By dawn, I understood the letter was just the deposition again, dressed in softer font. My mother had written to me that night, but the phrase "managed properly" did all the actual talking. She came the next morning for her answer. I met her on the porch under the dead bulb and kept my voice as low as hers had ever been. "You can't buy back what you threw away, Mom. And I'm done paying interest on being your daughter." Something in her face closed like a bank at 5 o'clock. She walked to her car and from the open door gave me one last look. "Then you'll lose the license, too," she said. That was the final conversation my mother and I ever had as mother and daughter. The trap. The formal offer arrived the following week on Voss's letterhead. Elegant the way a trap is elegant. $700,000, styled as a family settlement, in exchange for full withdrawal of the will contest. And one paragraph lower, the sentence that had been aimed at me from the very beginning. "It has been our client experience that licensing matters tend to resolve themselves once families reconcile." Translation: pay us and the board complaint quietly evaporates. Fight us and it doesn't. And if I fought, Voss noted, almost apologetically, my medical history from November of 2015 would be subpoenaed and read into open court, in a county whose newspaper still printed probate notices right between the football scores. Understand the math I was staring down. 700,000 was roughly 20%, and Harriet believed we'd win, but believed is a lawyer's word. Meanwhile, the board investigation could grind on for a year or more, with my badge sitting in a drawer. My savings were down to $3,000, and the price of victory was standing in front of my hometown while a lawyer read my psychiatric records aloud. Even my own attorney, the one I was paying with money I barely had, told me plainly that taking the deal was the rational move. Keep 80% and my privacy. He'd seen people pay more for less. Even the math of surrender looked reasonable. That's exactly what a good trap looks like.
Harriet stayed quiet for a long time when I asked her opinion.
The trust can survive a trial, she said finally. It was built to. The real question, Ensley, is whether you want to survive it too. Nobody gets to grade you on that answer. They sent a draft agreement with a signature line and a little plastic arrow, my mother's arrow, pointing precisely where I was supposed to end it. I sat at the green table that night with the agreement flat in front of me, pen uncapped. I'm being honest. I had decided to sign it. 20%, just to make it stop. People pay more for less. My hand was actually moving when the knock came. Ruth, with Carmen behind her, holding a pie like a second opinion. Neither of them asked what the papers were. Gray-haired women don't have to. They sat down at the table where they'd sat all winter. Ruth put her hand flat on the pages, not grabbing, just resting, the way you'd rest a hand on a casket. Let me tell you what I watched for 10 years, she said. Every single evening, 7 o'clock, that porch light came on. Rain, snow, the night of her diagnosis, the night she died. I used to check it from my own kitchen window like a lighthouse. I asked her once why she didn't just leave it burning all day. Marlene said, "Because then it wouldn't mean anything, Ruthie. It has to be a choice. It has to cost a little every single day, or it's not a promise. It's just a bulb." Carmen cut into the pie without asking. "She wasn't leaving you money, honey," Ruth said. "Money was the smallest thing in that house. She was leaving you witnesses." I looked at the signature line, at the little plastic arrow, and Ruth asked the question I've turned over every day since. You've spent your whole life paying for their love, Ensley. Whatever this paper costs you, add it to that same pile. What's the interest rate on that? I sat with that for a long moment. Then I picked the agreement up, squared the pages the way Voss himself might have, and tore it in half. It was the best sound I'd heard since Nana used to laugh. Nobody at that table knew yet what I planned to do instead, including me, until I finally said it out loud. To beat their story, I have to tell mine. All of it. Under oath. Here's what I understood, sitting at that table. Their entire arsenal, the deposition, the complaint, the settlement letter, all of it, ran on a single fuel source. My silence. Those 72 hours were only a weapon as long as I treated them like a wound. A secret can be extorted. A story can't. The next morning, I sat in Harriet's office and gave my instructions. And for once in my life, I didn't soften a single one of them. No settlement, no counteroffer, no delay. And then the part that made my own attorney visibly blink. I would sign a waiver and voluntarily release my own behavioral health records into the case myself, before Voss ever got the chance to subpoena a single page. You cannot threaten to expose what a woman has already laid on the table in her own handwriting. The blackmail died on that signature. 18 months of leverage, gone with a single stroke of a pen. Because people who keep ledgers can never quite imagine giving away the very thing they could have charged the most for. Then we built a witness list, and it wasn't lawyers. It was Dr. Patel and 20 years of medical charts. It was Dana, the hospice nurse who'd actually run Nana's case. And it was the green table. Ruth, Carmen, the whole gray-haired nation of Maple Glen. The people who'd watched a porch light burn for 11 straight years and knew exactly who it burned for. Harriet studied the list for a long time. "Your grandmother said you'd get here," she said. She hoped it wouldn't cost this much. The night before the hearing, I ironed my scrubs out of pure habit, stood there holding a uniform I wasn't currently allowed to wear, hung it back up, and chose a gray dress instead. In 6 hours, the whole county was going to hear about the worst night of my life. From me, first. The hearing. The evidentiary hearing opened in November, and the courtroom was full, which in Corrin County means the church crowd, the diner crowd, and a reporter from the county paper with a fresh legal pad. Voss went first, and I'll give the man this much credit: he was good. For an entire day, he built a completely different woman out of my outline. A trained medical professional embedded inside a dying widow's home, with access to her routines, her moods, her medications. A granddaughter with, and here he let the pause do all the work. A documented psychiatric history, who stood to gain $3.5 million from an old woman's suddenly altered estate plan. My mother testified in a blue suit, tissue balled in her fist, and she was devastating. Poised, wounded, entirely reasonable. We only ever wanted to manage things properly. Ensley is fragile. She's been fragile for years. We were trying to protect her, and my mother-in-law, both. She grieved far more convincingly on that witness stand than she ever had at the actual casket. Then Kayla, my cousin, 26 years old, avoiding my eyes entirely, testified that I had kept to myself and gotten close to Mrs. Woods near the end. Two entirely innocent facts rearranged into fingerprints. That was the day I learned you can lose a person twice. The judge listened to all of it without a flicker of expression. Ruth sat behind me the whole day, Carmen behind her, and behind Carmen, 3 full rows of gray heads who had no legal function whatsoever, except that Judge Marsh could count. When court adjourned, Voss packed his briefcase, looking like a man comfortably ahead on points. Honestly, he was. Judge Marsh peered over her glasses. "Miss Woods, the court will hear you tomorrow morning at 9. That night, the porch light clicked on at 7, and I sat beneath it and rehearsed absolutely nothing. Because Nana always said, the truth doesn't need rehearsal. It just needs a witness willing to go first. The testimony. I took the stand at 9 the next morning, in the gray dress, and I used the only voice I actually own, the 4 in the morning voice, the one reserved for frightened people in dark rooms, low and level and unhurried. And I told it. All of it. October of 2014. 2 weeks past my 18th birthday. A key that wouldn't turn. 2 suitcases packed by my mother, sweaters folded neatly, because she folds everything, even an abandonment. My father's shape behind the curtain. My mother's voice through 4 inches of open door. Family is a ledger, Ensley, and you are deep in the red. I watched the court reporter type my mother's own sentence into the permanent record of the state of Ohio. I told them about the walk in the dark and the porch light coming on. And then, because it was finally mine to tell, I told them about November of 2015, 19 years old, 13 months into exile. The night my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my thoughts turned into a drain I couldn't climb out of. The drive I made alone to the county hospital. The form I signed alone. The 72 hours. The form I signed to leave alone. Counsel has called me fragile, I said, looking at no one but Judge Marsh, keeping my voice exactly where I keep it, at a bedside. I checked myself in at 19 with no one to call. I checked myself out, and I finished nursing school, and I've spent 6 years sitting with this county's dying. I'm told that's called a psychiatric history. On my ward, we call it surviving. Then Harriet stood and read my waiver into the record, Every page of those records, released voluntarily by me weeks earlier. And I watched the leverage my parents had mined out of my worst night dissolve into vapor in a silent courtroom. Last, she laid the dates out plainly. The trust had been born in March of 2015, 5 months after the porch. It was amended for the final time in January of 2024, 9 months before any diagnosis, with 2 doctors certifying her mind that same week. My grandmother didn't change her plan because I got close to her money, I said. She changed it because she watched them come for hers. I stepped down. My mother was staring at me, and beneath all that composure, something had begun, very quietly, to slide. Then came the afternoon I want read at my own funeral someday. Dr. Patel, with 20 years of charts and 2 capacity letters, gave his flat professional opinion that Marlene Woods possessed a degree of financial acumen exceeding my own. Dana, the hospice nurse of record, walked the court through every medication log and every visit note, confirming under oath that I had never once handled her chart, her medications, or her paperwork. That in the file, I was listed only as family. Then the gray-haired nation took the stand, one by one, and the courtroom stopped belonging to Voss. Carmen, who'd fed half the county at one point or another, told Judge Marsh that Marlene had planned this trust the way she planned everything. Ma'am, sober as a hymn and twice as loud. And Ruth, 71, hands folded, 30 years next door, testified about the porch light. The timer set in October of 2014. The bulge she'd watched from her own kitchen window every evening for 11 years. Rain and snow and holidays, and the very night Marlene died. Still burning. That light was for the girl, she said. Everyone on Sycamore Street knew what it meant. It meant that child had a home, whether her parents wanted her or not. Voss tried to cross-examine her, gently suggesting elderly neighbors sometimes misremember things. Ruth looked at him over her glasses the way you'd look at gum stuck to a pew. Old women notice things, young man. It's all we do. The gallery laughed, and Judge Marsh let them. That's when my mother finally broke. Not a scream at first. A correction. She stood up at the petitioner's table, over Voss's hand on her arm, because a courtroom full of strangers was smiling at a version of the family where she was the villain. And my mother had never once in her life lost control of a narrative. We fed her for 18 years, she said, too loud for the room. You don't get to walk away from a debt like that. Family is a ledger. It is. And there it was. 50 strangers, a court reporter, and a judge, all hearing my mother state the household religion, out loud, in her own voice. The exact sentence from the porch, and no one had had to drag it out of her. She'd handed it over freely. Judge Marsh called a 30-minute recess. When she returned, she had the trust in one hand and a ruling in the other. The ruling. Judge Marsh read from the bench and did not hurry. The petition to invalidate the trust of Marlene Woods. Denied. With prejudice. On the question of capacity, the court found 2 independent, contemporaneous medical certifications and the testimony of a treating physician of 20 years standing, against 0 medical evidence submitted by the petitioners. On undue influence, the court found, and I'm quoting the words that mattered most to me, no evidence whatsoever that the beneficiary influenced this estate plan, and abundant evidence that the plan was a response, many years in the making, to the petitioner's own prior conduct. The trust stood. Every bolt Nana had tightened held firm. Then, Article 9. The court found the contest had been brought without probable cause, which, under the clause, meant the conditional bequests were forfeit entirely. My parents had sued for $3.5 million, and the final arithmetic of their ambition came due at zero, minus the $10,000 each my grandmother had left them as bait, minus their own legal fees. The court further noted it would entertain a motion from the trustee to recover fees from the petitioners. My mother took the news the way you take a diagnosis. My father took it staring at his keys. Out in the hallway, by the tall windows, she crossed to me one final time. Up close, her composure had developed hairline cracks, fine as a windshield the morning after a cold night. "After everything we gave you," she said, and I believe it was the single truest thing she ever said to me. Not sorry, not even really angry, just the ledger, opened to my page one final time. I heard my own voice come out the way it does when I switch off a monitor that's finished doing its job. Quiet and finished. Then consider us settled. I walked past her, through the doors, out into the November cold, and I did not look back. After. This is the part where I'm supposed to tell you it felt like victory. It felt more like a discharge. Someone I'd been treating my whole life had finally been released. I want to be straight with you about the cost, because every real win has one, and any story that skips this part is lying to you. The county paper ran it on page 2. My name, the trust, and a single paragraph, sourced from the public record I had opened myself, about a 19-year-old girl and 72 hours in the behavioral health unit. For a week, people at Hartman's looked at me 1 second too long, and I let them. That was the price of taking the weapon out of their hands, and I'd pay it again. But I did pay it. Privacy, once spent, doesn't refund. There was one more thing. That night, sitting under the porch light, I opened my phone and found the contact still saved as Mom and Dad, a habit 10 years dead. I didn't block the number. Blocking is for doors someone might still knock on. I just deleted it, and the screen asked if I was sure, and for the first time in my adult life, the answer came clean. The girl who'd kept a door cracked open for them was gone. I'd left her on the witness stand, under oath, right where she finally got to matter. 6 weeks after the ruling, the Board of Nursing closed the complaint as unsubstantiated, and my supervisor handed my badge back across her desk with wet eyes and a speech she couldn't quite finish. On my first shift back, an 80-pound farm widow held my hand at 3 a.m. and told me I had calm hands, and I had to step out into the hallway for a minute, on my own time. The house became fully mine once the appeal window closed, and I did with it exactly what Nana would have done. Nothing dramatic and everything deliberate. The green table runs full again every Sunday morning. Ruth, Carmen, the whole gray-haired nation, pancakes on the old griddle. The coffee is still criminally weak because some recipes are load-bearing. The rent from the Spool and Thimble building, $3,800 a month, goes into something Harriet helped me set up called the Marlene Fund. It pays for respite care, a weekend off, a paid aide, a tank of gas for family caregivers across Corrin County, the daughters and granddaughters sleeping in recliners next to hospital beds. No application longer than 1 page, and no payback ever. House rule. That spring, a single envelope arrived from Dayton, my father's handwriting alone. Inside was a check for $3,900, which meant nothing until I did the math. And then it meant everything. $150 a month from 16 to 18. He'd refunded the room and board to the dollar with one line on a sticky note. "I'm sorry." I didn't tear it up, and I didn't call. I signed it over to the fund, where it bought 11 exhausted caregivers a weekend of actual sleep. The only interest that particular debt was ever going to pay. In June, Ruth showed up on the porch with a girl named Nadia, 18, a nursing student whose own parents had put her belongings in garbage bags over a boy and a Pell Grant.
I heard myself tell her the rent was $1 a year, and no, she couldn't possibly owe me anything. House rule.
Then I walked to the hardware store and had a key cut, and handing it over felt like the entire estate changing hands a second time. This time, correctly. Tonight, it's late September again, nearly 12 years since 2 suitcases sat waiting on a porch. Through the kitchen window, I can see Nadia at the green table, anatomy flashcards spread out, wearing my old sweatshirt, eating pancakes she never had to pay for. At exactly 7 o'clock, the timer in the hall closet gives its familiar little click. The same click it's given every single evening since 2014. And the porch light comes on over Sycamore Street. Here's everything I know, and it fits into one sentence. Love doesn't keep books. It keeps a light on. And it turns out, a light like that can outlive the hand that first switched it on. That's my story. 2 suitcases on a porch. One page a judge read out loud. A porch light that never once went dark. If someone turned love into a ledger with you, hear this. You don't owe them your life, and you're allowed to stop paying interest on it. If this reached you on a hard night, share it with someone else sitting in the dark, and go check on whoever keeps a light on for you.